The Prove Me Wrong podcast is brought to you today by our friends at Java Remix. Java Remix is the perfect blend of 100% organic Arabica coffee infused with nano-emulsified CBD. Cannabidiol, or CBD, is fast gaining a reputation as a remedy to treat everything from anxiety to depression, inflammation to acne. And now it's available in your morning cup of Java. Go to javaremix.com right now and browse through their available products. Java Remix offers traditional ground coffee as well as single-serve K-Cups in both regular and decaf. And if you aren't a coffee person, Java Remix also offers CBD-infused teas, bath bombs, and body scrubs. And for our Prove Me Wrong listeners, go online right now, that's javaremix.com, and enter the promo code Prove Me Wrong for a 20% discount off your entire shopping experience. And Java Remix also offers free shipping on all orders over $40. Once again, that's javaremix.com, promo code Prove Me Wrong. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Prove Me Wrong podcast. I'm your host, Pete Lieb. My guest tonight is author, researcher, and friend of the program, Mr. Ken Gerhard. We are going to talk about the Mothman sightings tonight in the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the mid-60s, which some have also connected to the collapse of the Silver Bridge connecting West Virginia to Ohio in 1967. Was the sighting of the Mothman a predictor to the collapse? And have there been other sightings since in other places, maybe predicting other tragedies? We're going to discuss this and more tonight. As I said before, Ken is a friend of the program and is a fixture on the History, Travel, and National Geographic channel for his work, as well as a researcher and author of several books regarding monsters of all kinds, including the book Encounters with Flying Humanoids, Mothman, Man-Birds, Gargoyles, and Other Winged Beasts, which we'll touch on a bit tonight. You can find Ken's other books on Amazon.com and on his website, kengerhard.com. You spell Gerhard Gerhard. And once again, he's back with me today. So welcome back, Ken, to the Prove Me Wrong podcast.
Good evening, Pete. It's good to be back with you again. Thank you so much for having me on.
Hey, no problem. Hopefully the quarantine's working all right for you so far.
I'm hanging in there, and certainly wishing all of your listeners the very best. Hope everyone is keeping safe and feeling well.
Absolutely. Well, I know the last time we were on, for anybody who's interested, we talked about the Essential Guide to Bigfoot. And well, I guess my first question then is, Ken, any truth to the rumor right now that Bigfoot has actually come out of the forest and he's looking for humans now that we've all disappeared? Any truth to that?
Well, I haven't received any additional reports or anything, if that's what you're asking me, but it would certainly make sense,
right?
Because as I write about in the book, I'm firmly convinced that Bigfoot is built to avoid us. That's one of its major adaptations, behavioral adaptations, and if humans aren't out in the woods, Bigfoot's probably peeking out from behind the tree, wondering where
we are, right? Well, you hear
maybe he's on the move. So I mean, it would certainly make sense. Other animals I see are in the news are starting to come out a little bit more. Bears and other animals that are sometimes more reticent. So
exactly, like dolphins are in the canals in Venice. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but I had read that. So a lot of nature is kind of coming back, since we've been going away. But that that would actually be a pretty funny Jack Link's jerky commercial. I don't know if if Bigfoot just kind of walks out of the woods and he's looking around, wondering where we all are. Here's your chance, and we're not around. But anyway, I'm sorry. I digress.
No, you're right. I'm sure someone's putting that together as we speak.
They should. Or I'll give you that idea. If you want to pose it to them, you can get whatever you want out of it. But so we're talking the Mothman tonight. I'm sorry. But first, if we could, what are some of those other winged humanoids? We're talking about your book, Encounters with Flying Humanoids. We're going to talk about the Mothman, but what are some of the others? i.e. man-birds, gargoyles. How many, do we get a lot of sightings of man-birds and things like that?
Well, yeah, surprisingly we do, Pete, and that was one of the things I wanted to address in my book. There certainly have been other books specifically on the Mothman phenomenon, but I wanted to take a wider look at the mystery, and it seems like around the world there are similar types of creatures. Now, the physical descriptions are not identical. They vary a little bit from place to place, but the notion of kind of an anthropomorphic creature with a, combining the characteristics of a humanoid with wings of a bird or a bat is actually kind of pretty widespread around the world and dates back in different traditions a long time. So probably the most famous would be in England, in the south of England, there's a character known as the Owl Man, and it's been sighted in Cornwall, in far southwest England, usually around the wooded area around this old church and graveyard called Mothman Church. And the Owl Man was mostly sighted in 1976, but there's a more recent sighting in the 80s. It's been sighted a few times, a little bit smaller than Mothman, gray, humanoid, but with gray feathers, wings, and big red eyes like Mothman, black pincer-like feet. There are also flying humanoids have been reported from Mexico. I've investigated some reports down around Monterrey of a quote-unquote Birdman that lives there in the La Huasteca, in this remote mountainous region. Sometimes comes to town, allegedly. There's the Bird Woman of Da Nang, Vietnam, that was sighted at least once or maybe a couple of times in Vietnam during the war. This weird leathery winged female bat-like creature. And then, in traditions around the world, if you go back, even hundreds of years, you have, even, thousands of years, you have, the ancient Sumerians talked about beings known as the Apkallu, which were like winged men, a sort of demigods. Pazuzu in the Assyrian mythology. And then you have, from Europe, you have things like the Scree of Scotland or the Banshee of Ireland. So, they seem to be all over the world, but the physical descriptions vary, but a lot of the themes and motifs seem to be similar to the Mothman phenomenon. So, and I still get modern sightings. I get, not too often, but maybe every couple months, I'll 2 or 3 months, I'll be contacted by someone who claims they've seen one of these things. And so I still take reports from individuals that are, they don't know where else to turn. So an obvious person, if they've seen one of these creatures or believe they have, they want to tell their story. So I get a lot of those types of accounts, but they seem pretty widespread. But again, physical differences, but also some similarities in terms of some of the surrounding residual phenomenon that goes along with it.
What was it about the original story of the Mothman that drew you to writing a book about it or researching it? What was it about that story?
Well, I've always been fascinated with Mothman since I was a kid. My mother used to regale me with stories of what she called the West Virginia Mothman, and I always thought it was a pretty creepy sounding whatever it was. And then, of course, when I was younger, I read the Mothman Prophecies by John Keel, excellent book that kind of covers the phenomenon that was going on at that time in the 60s, and some of his subsequent books touched on it. And then there were other authors that kind of flirted with the theme of flying humanoid type creatures. And but I finally had an opportunity to travel Point Pleasant for the first time back in 2010. And I did a TV show and I did an investigation there, and then I've been back several times since to Point Pleasant and the TNT area. And then I also did an episode of a TV show called Monster Quest for History Channel, and they sent me down to Mexico to that Monterrey area to investigate the flying humanoids down there, and there were sightings throughout Mexico at that time. And so then it just kind of, I had a publisher at the time already, and was kind of talking to them about ideas, and I mentioned Mothman, and I said, there are things like Mothman that are kind of being reported in other places, and that's where the idea for the book came from.
So when did the sightings begin to take place in West Virginia? Can you give us a little bit about the story?
Yeah, I can give you the exact timeline.
That'd be great.
Pretty well documented at this point. November 15th. Well, first of all, for your listeners, Point Pleasant, West Virginia is a sleepy little town on the Ohio River. It's in far western Virginia, or West Virginia. And just outside of Point Pleasant, there's an old area called the TNT area, which used to manufacture explosives during World War II. There were factories there, and it's also littered with a bunch of these concrete dome-like structures that are storage facilities for explosives and hazardous materials. So it was abandoned by the 60s, and so the local kids from Point Pleasant would go out there and on the weekends and party and do whatever teenagers do. But on one particular night, November 15th, 1966, two young couples, Linda and Roger Scarberry and Steve and Mary Mallett, were driving in a 57 Chevy through the area looking for trouble. As I say, that trouble, they were looking to meet up with other people or to see what was going on, basically. And they claimed that as they were leaving the area, they were next to this old abandoned building called the power plant. They saw this creature that they described as legs, very dark color. It seemed to have bat-like wings that were up against, folded up against its back, and its head was either absent or low slung. And they described these giant red glowing eyes, though, that were kind of in the chest area. And these red eyes apparently had this hypnotic effect on everyone in the car. They were just kind of frozen there for a few minutes, and then this thing shuffled off into the building, and right as they got to the edge of Point Pleasant, to the edge of town, the thing veered off. And then they kind of stopped in a local drive-in there called Tiny's, and they talked about what they had just experienced, about whether they should report it to the police. And of course, they were torn because they didn't want to be. They thought no one would ever believe them, but They were also scared this thing was dangerous. So they did ultimately go to the sheriff's office. They talked to Deputy Millard Halstead, who was on duty. He knew all these kids because it was a small town. They didn't seem to be drunk or under the influence, but he knew them to be, honest, as far as he knew honest people. And so they went back and investigated and didn't see the Mothman when they returned, reluctantly. But this all made the newspapers, and of course, it became big news, picked up by news wires around the world. So that was the kind of the shot heard around the world. And then the following night, there was a sighting where a woman near the TNT area was unaware of the events of the night before, was getting out of her car, and she claims this Mothman rose up behind her, and same thing, the glowing red eyes, and she kind of collapsed there for a minute before she was able to run into the house. There were mobs of people looking for this thing throughout the area, and then the story just got weirder and weirder. There were UFO sightings. Men in black supposedly were visiting some of the witnesses. There were dozens of more sightings within the, following weeks. And, as you mentioned, of course, events culminated about a year later on December 16, 1967, when the Silver Bridge collapsed into the Ohio River, and that was right there between Point Pleasant and Ohio, and 46 people drowned in the icy rivers, in the icy river there. So it was a pretty huge tragedy. And after that, the Mothman seemed to fade out, and so that's why many people in and around Point Pleasant and elsewhere to this day feel there is a connection or a link between the appearance of the Mothman and this tragic bridge collapse.
So there were sightings all the way up from November of 66, you said, through December of 67, prior to that bridge, or was it sporadic?
John Keel claimed he documented up to 100 sightings. Most of the major ones made the newspaper. They were primarily in the earlier part of 67, so after the Scarberry Mallet sighting, and then they began to diminish.
Were there any other sightings that were, because I know the first one you described there were 4 people who saw that. Were there other groups that had sightings at the same time, or were the rest of them kind of individual sightings? Do you know?
Well, there's a woman named Faye DeWitt who's been on several TV shows, and she claims that she and her brother were driving through the area and that they got chased by the Mothman. I don't think I've ever heard her brother give any testimony anywhere as to that, what happened. And but she's talked about that. But other than that, all of the other sightings I can think of were pretty much individual sightings. There was an account from Charleston, West Virginia, near, closest city, where 2 girls claim they got chased by the Mothman. Other than that, most of them I think were single individual encounters and sightings that I can, off the top of my head. But there probably are a couple more that include multiple eyewitnesses, but not too many.
And there wasn't anything in terms of like physical evidence. It was just eyewitness accounts?
Correct. There were no trace evidence, no photographs.
Because you said they went out and they were looking for him. There were search parties organized, something like that.
There were hordes of people that would go out to the TNT area for that period and try to look for this thing. And, there were sightings reported, but no one collected any evidence, physical evidence that I'm aware of or anything like that. And there were certainly no photographs taken. So no footprints that I can think of that being described or anything like that. So, it seemed like a very kind of spectral, and to me still seems like kind of a spectral entity, something that's not wholly physical,
Mm-hmm.
Corporeal.
Was the book, you had mentioned that it kind of got tied, the sightings got tied to the collapse of the bridge. Were they doing that? Did they make that connection prior to the Mothman Prophecy book, or was that the first time that it had those two things have been linked?
Now, I've spoken to locals in town that I'm sure haven't really read the books because they don't need to. They live there. They lived it, and the locals that I've spoken to in and around Point Pleasant, they already made that connection just because of the time period, because it's all that stuff seemed to be happening right around the same time. So it just seemed like it was all possibly related somehow. That was the impression they got. But of course, there's no doubt that the book certainly, sold that theory even more and to a wider audience. So there might be some influence there.
How close to reality was the book?
It's hard to say because it was kind of written from John Keel's point of view. And I think most of it is probably pretty accurate in terms of what he described happening and what he interviewed people. But I am slightly critical of Keel in my own book. I have found a few instances, and this is not just with regard to Mothman, but Keel's been involved in Fortean unexplained phenomenon in other areas and cryptozoology. And there are other things that he has said or written about through the years, or he had said or written about through the years that seemed a little bit embellished. And moreover, there's some things in the book that don't quite match with eyewitness testimonies that I've heard from some of the original eyewitnesses. So Keel claimed that, to my understanding, Keel claims, I've never met the man, unfortunately, but we have friends in common, and one of those colleagues told me that Keel explained to him that the publisher was actually the story a little bit.
Right.
So I don't know, that may be true in some cases. Hey, look, I've done a lot of television shows. TV producers always want to kind of, amp things up a little bit more and make them seem more exciting. So, I could see that being part of the issue. But I think overall, I think he did a huge service in terms of bringing the phenomenon to the world and kind of laying it out in a way that I think most people can understand in terms of trying to relate the different things that were going on at that time. Now, there is kind of, if you've read the book, there's a little tinge of kind of a quasi-paranoid thing that Keel has going on, that, ultimately he believed he was becoming a target of some type of conspiracy and, getting weird phone calls and threatening, phone calls and things like that. I've heard an account that he claimed that he was visited by men in black one time. So, that may or may not be true. We'll never know because, sadly, Keel passed away many years ago. But, I think like all things that we look at in the fields of cryptozoology and other fields relating to unexplained phenomenon, there probably are things that have been kind of misconstrued and misinterpreted through the years. And, a lot of that has to do with popular culture and the way that we look at these things.
No, I definitely expected, there to be some level of fiction to it. But it was kind of interesting because, obviously a lot of people, maybe the only introduction they've ever had to that is the book or the movie. That movie with, I believe it was Kevin Costner in 2002, early 2000s. That may have been the only real, and obviously a movie, you can't really expect that to be true to life. some books are closer to real than others. You have the Amityville horrors of the world, which have been debunked several times.
Yeah.
Yeah, things like that. So that's all. I was just kind of wondering, how close he had gotten to real life.
Well, one thing I can say in Keel's favor is that he had joined forces with a woman named Mary Heyer, who was the local beat reporter there in Point Pleasant. And so she knew everyone in town. And of course, as a reporter, I think she was trying to do more of a sort of report the facts and the stories as they came in as accurately as possible. So I think the fact that he and Mary and John were working closely together for several months on the case, interviewing witnesses, going to the TNT area. So I like to think that maybe she kind of, rubbed off on him in that respect, or maybe a lot of the information he was getting from her and from the locals was kind of being vetted through that process because, as I said, they were working together, and I'm sure as a journalist, she was probably more focused on the facts of the case. So, but there's one big misinterpretation right off the top is the name. Mothman did not appear right away in the newspapers, and of course, the creature that's been reported has no features that really resemble a moth at all, except maybe big eyes, if you consider that. But so, I mean, for example, for several weeks when the first reports came in, it was being referred to as the bird, the Mason County bird, and that's how it was being reported in all the newspapers. And in fact, a couple of the early eyewitnesses claimed that what they saw was a giant bird and not a humanoid type creature. So that got a little bit confusing there for a bit. So,
well, in your work with cryptids, do you think the Mothman, the bird, do you think that was really some undiscovered cryptid, or could it be something more supernatural in your opinion?
Well, I'm a little biased because I've investigated for decades accounts of monster-sized birds throughout Texas, Alaska, and other parts of the United States. And I've interviewed hundreds of eyewitnesses that claim they've seen giant birds with wingspans ranging from 12 to 20 feet across. So I'm already kind of inclined to at least entertain the possibility that such a thing could exist. So in that respect, I think that and certainly there have been sightings of these Thunderbirds, as the Native Americans call them, in West Virginia as well, and in Ohio. So, I think that's a possibility, at least, that something like a Thunderbird, if you're open to that possibility, could explain some, if not all of the sightings. But then it's hard to quantify that and consider all the other things that were reported in terms of the UFO activity and the poltergeist activity and Men in Black and conspiracies and all that other stuff that kind of came into the picture.
So you're saying that at the exact same time, during the time when we're seeing the Mothman, we're also having UFO sightings as well?
Yeah, in fact, there were probably more sightings of UFOs that were reported than Mothman, and they were all over like the TNT area and very concentrated around Point Pleasant. I'm not going to say like clear daylight sightings of silvery discs. They were usually lights in the sky that were seen at night, but anomalous lights that were colorful and didn't look like anything man-made and moved in mysterious ways and things like that. But yeah, there were a ton of UFO sightings that were making the newspaper on a daily basis along with the Mothman sightings. And
did they also stop once the Mothman sightings died down?
That's a good question. I haven't really, honestly, I get the impression they have, but it's been a while since I've done all this research because the book came out a few years ago, and so I can't remember if, there may have been some, but I don't think enough to really have drawn much attention, if that, because I'm not aware of any major UFO sightings after the bridge collapse.
Yeah, because I was just trying to say if, was there a correlation between the two things? Where did they both spring up at the same time and they both die off at the same time? Then more than likely, maybe they are connected. That type of idea. Maybe the Mothman was some type of extraterrestrial or what have you. And
yeah, well, you're right. It's all speculation, Pete.
Right.
But that's a good point. But I will say, in terms of my investigations into flying humanoids in Mexico, there definitely seems to be a UFO connection there as well, because it's been a similar type of situation where these flying humanoids have been seen around the same time and in the same areas that UFOs have been reported fairly consistently. So,
so there have been other sightings as well, right? Outside of West Virginia at that time frame. I've also read something about potentially Mothman sightings more recently in the Chicago area. Is that accurate?
Well, I haven't personally interviewed any of those witnesses or investigated those cases, but I've, the primary researcher on those cases is a guy named Lon Strickler, who has a website called Phantoms and Monsters, and he initially began to send me those accounts from Chicago when he started receiving them a couple years ago. So I would get them and look over them, and then they seem to just keep going and going and going. So I think there are a couple of other investigators now that have gotten involved with that. And there is something to it. I mean, there's no doubt. I don't think it's all being fabricated, because I think there are more people that are kind of involved in the research now. So there's kind of a peer review thing going on. But, since I haven't personally interviewed any of the witnesses or just based on what I'm reading, I mean, it seems similar to the Mothman flap in terms of what people are describing. But there are also some issues in terms of some of the sightings are very ambiguous. I saw something with wings, but I couldn't tell what it was, but it was a big shadowy thing, so they're not real clear defined sightings. It's just kind of fleeting glimpses and things like that. But, I'd be willing to say where there's smoke, there's fire. I'm sure that, maybe there are some valid cases, at least the early cases there probably have some legs.
I'm always thinking of, if we're talking a cryptid, I'm also always thinking of habitat. And I don't think there's anybody who would think that Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Chicago, Illinois are a similar habitat. And so it's that was where I was kind of thinking of that is, if these are cryptids,
it's definitely not.
where is that
not,
cryptid?
Right.
Yeah, where is it staying? Where is it living?
I should
go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. But I should have probably started this interview by pointing out that, as a cryptozoologist, most of the things I investigate I believe, are undiscovered animals. And that pertains to Bigfoot, Thunderbirds, Loch Ness Monster, Black Panthers, whatever. Things like Mothman tend to be more of a kind of a fringe area, and I don't know if there's some cryptozoologists that might look at it that way, but I certainly don't view it as an animal or even a biological entity. I think it's some type of metaphysical or supernatural thing, based on the physical descriptions, the behaviors, the habitats, everything that you've just you kind of alluded to. It's just too weird. It's high weirdness. But that said, there is room to kind of, because of what we talked about with possible Thunderbird sightings mixed in and things like that, it creates an opening for cryptozoologists at least to take an interest in some of these topics, to see if there might be potentially a zoological explanation in some of the cases.
High weirdness is a great term. I'm going to use that. High weirdness.
I didn't come up with that, but it kind of fits some of these cases.
That is a fabulous term. I've also read that there were other reports potentially that the Mothman, or again, some other winged creature, has been seen flying over or around other places very similar to the time of disasters. I've read reports that there have been sightings over Chernobyl prior to that disaster. There's an I-35 bridge in Minneapolis that about a month beforehand there had been some sightings as well. Have you heard of those also?
I've heard those, but I haven't seen or heard of anything substantial with regard to those claims. I think they're just mostly internet rumors. There's a hoaxed photo of a Mothman type thing flying in front of the Twin Towers before 9/11, but it's obviously hoaxed. I've never heard any. Like I said, they're just rumors with regard to Chernobyl and the Fukushima disaster and some of these others. But there are some precedents in history, Pete. If we look back, for example, in Scotland, back in 1746, going back right before the infamous Battle of Culloden Moor, there was claims that this winged Mothman type creature, a gigantic black bird-like creature, appeared and flew over the battlefield before the battle commenced. And it fits very well into the description of something in Scotland that's known as a scree, which is basically like a warning or an omen type of entity. And that in that particular battle, there were like 1,500 men that lost their lives. There was also a train wreck involved in, I think, another battle where there was a train wreck, and right before that all these soldiers boarding the train had seen this winged creature. So, I mean, there are cases in history of these things. Pazuzu, I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but
no.
Pazuzu is a ancient Assyrian king or demon king, and Pazuzu was basically like a winged humanoid creature. And if you look at the interpretations of the legend, it was basically associated with different types of famines and pestilence and all kinds of, hordes of locusts and things like that. So it was considered, if Pazuzu appeared, it was considered to be kind of a harbinger of some type of tragedy. So there are kind of references, but, most of them are in the past and not with regard to these modern calamities that I'm aware of.
How does a Mothman differ from something like a gargoyle? Is it just a matter of the different lore, the different ways it was used, or are there physical differences?
Well, the term gargoyle is a bit vague, I suppose. In terms of my book, I used it to describe winged creatures that did not have human-like forms, but often had the forms of other animals, dog-like forms, the Jersey Devil, which is kind of a chimera that combines, different features, a horse-like head, bat-like wings, kangaroo-shaped body. There's something called the Brentford Griffin, which was like a winged dog-type creature that was sighted over England back in the 1980s. Bat Squatch, which is a creature it's a funny name, I know, but it's because it's been reported in the shadow of Mount Rainier, Washington, where there have been a lot of Sasquatch sightings, but there's also something called Bat Squatch, which is like a winged 9-foot-tall wolf-like creature with yellow piercing eyes. That's been reported up there. So, and even in Chile, there were sightings of kind of winged kangaroo-like creatures called chupacabras, probably just because it's south of the border. So, gargoyle can kind of mean any type, in my opinion, means kind of like any kind of winged creature that's not truly humanoid in nature, but, still should not have wings. It's not natural, of course. And I think that's the key thing that we have to realize here is any animal, humanoid or otherwise, that has wings and arms and 4 limbs, 6 limbs basically, is completely unnatural and not to be found in the fossil history, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about winged animals like birds and bats, I mean, they have 4 limbs, and, we're all tetrapods, all of us. I mean, we all 4-limbed animals, from humans to bats to whatever. So when you start talking about winged creatures that have arms or 4 limbs, 4 legs, that's when it gets into the high weirdness, in my opinion.
Right. So we've never, in terms of the Silver Bridge collapse, everything there, they found a reason for it. It wasn't something that they determined or deemed to be supernatural, things like that. I'm just trying to make sure, or put any type of link together between UFO sightings, Mothman sightings, bridge collapse. Was the collapse found to be ultimately structural in nature? Or
yeah. Was it? Well, it was a combination of things. It was a very old bridge. I don't think it had been intended to be used as long as it had.
Mm-hmm.
Let me try to think of when it was built here. It was built in 1928, and it was constructed of carbon steel. It was one of the first high-tension I-beam bridge designs. But there may have been ultimate analysis after the accident revealed that there might have been a structural defect in the bridge, basically involving what's called an I-bar. And in addition to that, the bridge had been used extensively since 1928. So, I mean, you certainly have to look at these things objectively and say, yeah, there are reasons the bridge collapsed. It was, it was old and a little bit defective. So, and there was a traffic jam on there at the time. So there were all these cars were parked on the bridge, basically. So, but that said, you can't deny the reality that this Mothman thing was going on around that same time period. And, I guess it all boils down to how we like to look at these things, but certainly some people are going to look at the big picture and say, well, that's just too much of a coincidence that you had this disaster and all this other weird stuff was happening at that same time.
So in your book, Encounters with Flying Humanoids, Mothman, Man-Birds, Gargoyles, and Other Winged Beasts, is there anything that you can remember off the top of your head in terms of tales from the book or stories from the book that you found particularly interesting?
Well, there's a modern Mothman sighting, and we talked about how they kind of trailed off after the 60s. For the most part, they did. But I did interview a gentleman named John Hypes, and he grew up in Point Pleasant, but I think he lives in Florida now. But he and his wife, they both work as professional nurses, and they were in the Point Pleasant area back in 2011. And they were driving across a different bridge, but a bridge coming into Point Pleasant. I guess it's the newer version of the Silver Bridge, if you will. And it was about 11 o'clock at night, and so they were, scanning for deer and stuff because there's a lot of deer in that area. They didn't want to hit a deer. And suddenly they both saw something on the right side of the road on the bridge. And standing there, and they slowed down because they thought it might be a deer. And as they got closer to it, things stood up, and they said that giant wings unfurled. And it's at night, so they couldn't see it real clearly, but they could see that it was huge and it had wings, and about 16-foot wingspan, and about 5 feet tall. And they got a good look at it, and then this thing basically took off and flew off into the night before long. But so it didn't have the big red glowing eyes that they could tell, but certainly there's nothing that exists in North America that we know of that has a 12 or 16-foot wingspan. And I interviewed John and his wife separately, and they gave very collaborating sort of testimony that they saw this giant winged creature near Point Pleasant in 2011. So I would assume that it might be the same creature that was reported as the Mothman, whatever it was.
What was the official police, governmental, whatever? What was the official version of what they thought it was? We'll tell a policeman, I saw Bigfoot, I saw a ghost, I saw a Mothman. We'll tell them that, or we would back then. They'll put something different on a piece of paper and say, well, you probably saw X.
Yeah.
What was the official version of what was being seen? Do you know?
Well, I don't know if law enforcement ever made any kind of declaration or assumption, but there were biologists that got involved. There was I remember there was I think a zoologist named Robert Smith from one of the nearby zoos or universities there that put out a theory that what people were seeing was a sandhill crane. Grus canadensis is the scientific name. Sandhill crane it's a big bird. It stands about 5 feet tall, but it's got a long neck and long legs. It's a wading bird, and it's a crane, and it's got these but it does have these red markings on its head, which, but it's kind of ludicrous because it's kind of a colorful white and gray with these. So, it's just hard for me to envision how people could mistake something like that for the Mothman, So it's kind of making an assumption, but that was one of the theories. More recently, you have different skeptics that have tried to argue that what people were seeing were just owls, just
really
owls.
Big owls.
Yeah, in particular, well, not even really big. There's one species called a barred owl that's native to the area, and barred owls are actually pretty tiny, but they have the big red eyes. They do have reddish eyes, but they're not very big. So, I mean, maybe if one was perched on something and you just caught a split second of it. The largest owls we have, of course, are Bubo virginianus, the great horned owls here in North America, and they have a wingspan of about 5 feet across. And I know I've been startled by big owls taking off at night right in front of the car or whatever. And, for a split second, you might think, wow, that's huge. But, It's certainly not as nearly as big as what people have described, but those are kind of the official explanations that have been put out there. Is basically it was some type of known bird species, and that it just became a matter of mass hysteria and a lot of hoaxes and fabrications and things.
Are sandhill cranes native to West Virginia? I mean, maybe they are. I don't know, but it seems like a crane to me is more southern, marshy.
They are primarily found in, that's a great question. As a cryptozoologist, that's one of the first things I would look at. They're mainly native to Canada, but they do migrate through that area.
Okay.
As they head south for the winter. But I think by December, when the Mothman sightings started, I would assume they had already migrated by then, because it's already frozen out and stuff. So they don't. But who knows? But yeah, I mean, it's they're not very common. I mean, it's not something you would see on a fairly regular basis in that area around Point Pleasant. But they are known to migrate through that area from time to time.
So I know you've spoke previously about the Thunderbird. I mean, if there were one of these flying humanoids or one of these flying creatures that you want to get definitive evidence on, is that the one?
That would be pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, it wouldn't have to be me. If anyone could prove these things exist, I think it would be one of the biggest zoological discoveries of the century. I mean, I don't remember how much we talked about it in the past, but I mean, there were birds that looked like this during the Ice Age here in North America, the teratorns. One species had an 18-foot wingspan. Now, most of the fossils have been found in the western U.S., but it's a fair presumption that they probably ranged across the continent, just like condors did. Condors used to be much more widespread than they are these days. But but the problem with Thunderbirds, I do have a lot of eyewitness sightings in my database, and I've spoken to many credible people that claim they've seen them, Pete, but there's just no physical evidence at all. I mean, there's no good photographs or giant feathers, or you think someone would find a nest or an egg shell or something that would indicate that these things live somewhere, but that just hasn't turned up yet. So as much as I pursue the mystery based on the sincerity of the people that I've interviewed, it does seem improbable sometimes that they could exist. Unlike Bigfoot, where you have at least trace evidence in terms of footprints that have been found and studied and things like that.
Yeah, and a bird doesn't seem like it has the wherewithal to try to be hidden, right? It's just out there flying, living its life.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, no, they're not the stealthiest animals. I understand that certain birds have different levels of intelligence, but not to the level of a primate or a hominid. Nothing quite to that level. So
I mean, I know I've seen eagles before. It's something with just a really significant, maybe a 6-foot wingspan. But I was pretty damn impressed seeing one like that up close and how big they really are. I don't know that most people really have an understanding of just how big some birds can get. So I mean, not that I'm proposing any alternate solutions there. But it's just, like I said, I've seen one. I hadn't seen one until maybe the last 3 years, and I was really amazed at how big it was.
No, you bring up a strong point. I mean, look, all cryptids, in my opinion, are ultimately cases of composite identity, meaning that it's not just one thing people are seeing, but probably a few different things that people are seeing and kind of grouping together.
Mm-hmm.
So in that light, there are absolutely misidentifications that do occur. And you can imagine, particularly after Mothman first made, or the Mason County bird, first made newspapers in that area back in November of '66, people were looking out more. People were kind of looking for things, looking to see if they'd find the Mothman. And possibly someone would get startled by a big eagle or a bird that they weren't expecting, and maybe they just get a fleeting glimpse, and then it does become Mothman, at least. So there probably are some cases like that where people misidentified big birds, known big birds, and they kind of got lumped in as Mothman sightings.
So my last question of the night then for you is, you kind of get the last word on the Mothman. Benevolent force warning us of incoming tragedy, the cause of the tragedy, or just wrong place, wrong time? What do you think was the Mothman's connection to what happened in Point Pleasant?
Pete, I'm 100% comfortable admitting that I have no idea what Mothman represents. And I also think, and this is important for people to accept, that there possibly are things going on in the world and the universe around us that we are just not capable of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
As omnipotent as we feel sometimes with our smartphones in front of us, there are a lot of things out there that, the mechanisms of our universe that maybe we don't understand. And if you're open-minded to the possibility that there are other planes of existence, realities, and, you can even take a scientific view to that and start looking at things like Einstein's multiverse universe. There are possibly other universes around us and things like that. So I view the Mothman and these other flying humanoid creatures as some type of metaphysical manifestation. I don't know where they come from. I don't know what's behind it, but I know that I get the sense that the experiences are real. I think these things seem physical when they're here. I mean, that's why people sense that they're not hallucinating, that these things have and that how there can be physical multi-witness sightings. Right. The correlations that I found between different cases are that they've been around a long time, because you can find similar creatures and traditions all over the world dating back hundreds and thousands of years. So they've been with us forever. There does seem to be a UFO link, and I'm not going to get into UFO theories because that's not my field of expertise, but whatever you think UFOs might be, there seems to be a connection. And the most important thing, I think, is the fear factor. And what I mean by that is that all of these flying humanoids seem to have a very nasty, malevolent disposition and really enjoy frightening the heck out of people. They chase cars, they jump up out of the dark, they're menacing, that said, there's no account on record of them actually physically hurting anybody.
Right.
So I don't think that they are dangerous in that sense. I just think that it feels like they somehow feed off of our emotions and our fears, and that it somehow fuels their existence. Now, if you wanted to get into really cosmic theories, there's something known as a tulpa, and John Keel wrote about these, and other writers have, and tulpas are theoretically thought projections. And the word comes from Buddhist priests in the Himalaya that would meditate into such a deep state that they could actually cause these things, these physical beings, to manifest in front of them. And who knows if there was some type of mind-altering element to that as well. But so this is all far-out stuff, but if you think there's a possible way that we are able to manifest via either our unconscious minds these things into our reality, or if it's an intelligence from elsewhere that uses us as kind of a conduit or a projector to put these things out in front of us for who knows what reason. But and there's also they could possibly be warnings. I don't know if I'm the strongest advocate of that possibility, but who knows? Maybe that's their intention, is they're sent somehow to warn us of things.
It just seems like, because you're talking about from the sightings and from the tales, they seem nasty, they seem aggressive, they're chasing cars, but they're not so nasty and aggressive that we actually catch one in a photograph or on video. It seems like if they were that aggressive, they wouldn't necessarily care. They'd be just coming at you. They're coming at you to try to mess with you, and something would be caught at this point. And so it's thought-provoking. And I asked, I brought it, I wanted to bring you in and talk to this because my father-in-law grew up in that West Virginia area, and he was very familiar with the Mothman and everything that went down in that area. And I know when I talked to him about it, he was very excited to kind of hear about it again, because he was a child, but it was something that was just ever present in his life for that time frame. And so it was very, he was very interested to hear our discussion.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think, like I said, the people that I've met there today, all these years later, and moreover, it's captured the public's imagination to the point where there's a festival there every year. I mean, they have a statue of Mothman in the town square at Point Pleasant. They have a museum, and then they have a festival every year that draws 10,000 people. I don't know if they'll pull that off this year,
right,
obviously, but so I mean, people travel in from all over the place. So I mean, Mothman has definitely captured the public's imagination, and it's for whatever reason, it's something that really touches us on a profound level.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us today, Ken. I really appreciate it. I know that in the current environment we're in, we're probably not have any personal appearances coming up, but is there anything else that you have coming up, or a new book, something like that you wanted to plug?
Well, just still promoting The Essential Guide to Bigfoot,
okay.
Which is my newest book, and I have an Amazon author page if people want to check that out. You can see that book as well as Encounters with Flying Humanoids, and my book Big Bird, which deals with these Thunderbird creatures. I also have a YouTube channel. You can seek that out, Ken Gerhard YouTube, and I started to post kind of little brief informative videos about a wide range of cryptids on there. Other than that, hopefully things will normalize a bit as the year goes on, and if so, then I will be speaking at the Mothman Festival in Point Pleasant in September, and also several Bigfoot conferences that are taking place in various parts of the country.
Well, my fingers are crossed for that, honestly. I mean, I hope so. I mean, I know they've been canceling a lot of things well out in advance. I know a lot of the concerts have been canceled already, which seems premature, but you never know.
Yeah,
exactly.
We just don't know at this point. So
fingers
thanks. Crossed. But,
yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. Thank you, Pete. Here's wishing everyone the best.
Thanks. We'll talk to you later. So once again, that was Ken Gerhard. Ken is talking about the Mothman scenario. We started with the Mothman. We started with kind of the situation, what occurred there. And then we kind of just went to all winged creatures in general, because I think that the Mothman was one scenario, one situation, but maybe there are, maybe it's a bigger picture, whether we're talking about Mothman, gargoyles, winged creatures of some kind. Who knows? I mean, I'm always skeptical of that because, again, where are these enormous beings living? Where are they living? How come we don't see them? They primarily, I would assume, get around flying. There really isn't a way to camouflage yourself when you're in the air. So it's not like Bigfoot that can hide behind a tree or hide in the deep woods somewhere. And there's a lot of area there that's densely wooded, provides a lot of camouflage. It gives you a habitat. I don't know with Mothman, gargoyles, Birdman, Thunderbirds. I don't know that they have that. I don't know they have that luxury of natural camouflage because, again, you're in the air. There's not really a tree there to hide behind. It's so difficult nowadays to find anything that you can believe in terms of video evidence, pictures, things like that, because, again, it's so easy to manipulate things online. You can manipulate videos, you can manipulate pictures. Like Ken had mentioned, there was a picture of a Mothman type creature circling around the Twin Towers before 9/11. And I had read that also, that 9/11 had some sightings potentially of a Mothman type figure prior to the actual bombing on that particular day. But he said it was obviously a fake. And so again, that's the risk you run, is that when you see these type of things, you want so badly to believe in what you're hearing or seeing or getting from people, eyewitness accounts, that you're likely to believe something you see that might be fake. It might just be forged. So I don't know. It's very difficult. Again, this was something that we wanted to talk about. There is a movie, Mothman Prophecies. There is a book made in 1975, Mothman Prophecies. I do expect that to be dramatized a little bit. Obviously, we're trying to sell books. We're trying to sell movies. So it's not going to be strictly to the facts of the case. But it definitely was something that captured the national interest in the late 60s. And we have still had those sightings going forward up until present day. Like I said, in Chicago, we've seen that. We've had reports from Chernobyl, reports from Minneapolis, Minnesota, prior to a bridge collapse. So you're seeing it. I don't know. What do you think? If you have any questions or comments about what we've talked about today, you can contact us on our email address. It's provemewrongcast@gmail.com. That's the email address. You can also find us on Facebook or Instagram, Prove Me Wrong. Just search for the name. It's the name of the program. If you're looking to find more content itself, we are on Spotify, TuneIn, SoundCloud, Stitcher, really any app that you use to find your podcast, you can find Prove Me Wrong Podcast. Like and subscribe to the podcast, and you will be the first one notified when a new episode releases every week. We're also on YouTube, as you can see the scroll right here. Like and subscribe to the Prove Me Wrong podcast page on YouTube. And once again, you will be the first one notified of new episodes. The Prove Me Wrong podcast is brought to you tonight as well by ZendoZones citronella burners from J.T. Eaton. They're shaped like fearless little bug-repellent tiki gods, so let Surf and Stan, Hawaiian Howie, and Luau Lily bring the islands to your backyard with ZendoZone citronella burners. ZendoZones uses natural 3% citronella candles and incense cones, perfect for patios, decks, backyards, campsites, poolside, and more. Enjoy the outdoors again. They are available online on Amazon.com and also at certain Ace Hardware stores. So collect them all today. So once again, from my guest tonight, Mr. Ken Gerhard, you can find him at kengerhard.com. Again, that's spelled Gerhard, Ken Gerhard. Find his books on Amazon.com. I'm Pete Lieb. This is the Prove Me Wrong podcast, and we'll talk to you again soon.